Well, I'll start by saying that I'd never given a university lecture before. So I kind of want to do this informally. I just, I know a lot of things, and I don't know what you guys know, and I don't know what you want to know. So I decided to sit down and kind of lay out 4 categories of stuff that we can talk about, and we can kind of just dive into one and see where that takes us. I've been asking everyone to tell me their name and their background. What are you studying and stuff?
My name is Fiona. I'm studying HCI.
HCI, Human Computer Interactions. Okay, great.
It's one of our master's program it's the oldest master's program that we have.
Okay, great.
That we collaborate with the School of Computer Science.
Okay. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. So you like video games?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Do you want to be a designer or like a tech person?
Yeah, maybe more on the design side.
Okay, cool. I could start talking about game design as a profession. So when I tell people that I'm a game designer, a lot of the time people don't know what I mean. Like, they don't know what my job is, right? And obviously most of you guys know what design actually is, but I'll talk a little bit about what the job entails. Basically spreadsheets. You need to kind of graph out the game in ways that different people understand on the team, right? Your job is the vision holder of the whole game, and you have to interact with basically every other member of the team to make sure that what they're doing is on track with the vision. Ideally, you listen to them and their ideas and recognize their expertise and bring that on board and use their ideas when necessary, and when they're good, when they're better than yours, which is a lot of the time, and really, like, basically keep everyone on track. And then once, and part of that, and part of the communication aspect of that is using spreadsheets to convey information. So I'll show you a couple of my spreadsheets later. Spreadsheets, communication, and documentation are very, very big aspects of my job. They're basically, there's no such thing as an entry-level game design position. Doesn't exist, because there is so much responsibility on the game designer that no one will hire someone who doesn't have any experience. When I started interviewing out of school, I studied level design in Montreal, and I wanted to be a game designer. And when I started applying to companies, the first question they asked me is, "What have you shipped?" And my answer was like, "Well, nothing yet, because like I'm still starting." And they're like, "Well, great, just go make some games. Just go make some games. Doesn't matter if they're good, as long as they're fun, right? Doesn't matter if they're pretty, as long as they're fun, right?" So as someone hiring a game designer, you want to make sure that someone can make a fun experience, right? And so that's kind of that's where we get into the user experience, right? What makes something fun, right? There's a book by Ralph Koster. This is a really excellent book called The Theory of Fun. Looks like this. And it turns out that people have fun when they're learning. School, school is kind of a bad example because it's not very interactive. It's typically in a lecture format, which can be more or less fun. But there's lots of things that lots of ways you can teach that are fun, as video games have shown, right? The main thing that video games are good at teaching are how to play the game, right? So if you're playing Mario, it's explicitly designed to teach you the many skills that you need in order to play that game properly. So I'll go to a quick example. Here, there's a level design. No, that's a thing. Just give me a second. Where did I put it? did a lot of this last minute. Progression, color, choose level design. No, we're gonna do it this way. I was playing Super Mario 2 last night, which is known in North America as Super Mario Lost Levels, because it was so hard that the Japanese thought the Americans couldn't handle it. So everyone knows about the first level of Mario 1, which is very famous for teaching you about the game, right? And this is no different. They do a very good job of teaching the game here. But it's way harder. The first level is brutally difficult. I mean, the whole game is brutally difficult. But it doesn't matter, because you're at the very beginning of the game. It doesn't matter how many times you die. You're right at the beginning of the game, so you're going to start there if you get game over. And you can you can go through the sequence as many times as you want. So they have a section here for learning about the interaction between turtles and blocks, learning about the interaction between mushrooms and blocks. Like if you hit this block, when the mushroom's going along it, it will jump, and then you can get it down here. Here you're going to hit all these blocks. You're going to see another mushroom. You're going to take it because it's a mushroom and it's a Mario game. It's going to kill you because it's a poison mushroom, right? And now you know that the black mushrooms are bad. You got to stay away from them. And that's more or less how video games teach. They show you an element and allow you the freedom to explore with that element. It's always learning by doing, and I think that's why I love video games so much, is because that's how I learn. If I haven't done something, I don't learn how to do it. You can tell me, but I need to do it and see it before I do. So yeah, teaching, fun. So that's a little intro. Why don't we kind of talk about what do you guys want to learn? Like, I'll just open it up to some questions that may be burning in your minds. Anyone have a question? Yes?
What is game design? How is game designer different to UX designer?
Good question. So in my view, on every project, there should be someone who is like the UX manager, okay? The person who who has at the front of their mind as their sole responsibility tracking the user experience across every discipline, right? Because what ends up happening is, let's say I'm a sound designer, okay? And I get some information. I get a task from management that we need this sound for this reason, and I'll deliver something. And no one's really going to vet it. It's not. No one's going to look at it necessarily in the context of the whole game as a whole, unless you have a very good creative director who will take care of who will nitpick in everything, right? There's not usually a person whose job it is to say like, well, no, that sound sounds too much like this other sound, right? And well, of course, the audio designer should take care of that, right? But they're not necessarily coming from an UX background, right? So to answer your question, a game designer cares about the rules. Like every person on the team should be a UX designer, basically. And the reason it's different from a game designer is because you have a specific set of skills you need to know to be a game designer versus a UX designer, right?
I could ask, what are the tasks that you do as a game designer? Like, I know that it's mostly because when I started at my game design program in my film school, I imagined that I would be mostly creating like game developments, but I found out that it's mostly about documenting, documentation and writing.
Yeah.
So what are the tasks that you get to build a game?
Well, you have to figure out what the rules are, right? You have to. It's about kind of crafting a possibility space, right? As my job, I'm a game and level designer, right? So I start out doing the game design, and I do a game design that will allow me to do the most interesting levels that I can, right? And the levels is ultimately the user experience. Right? You are, as a level designer, you're actually crafting the user experience because you're putting the blocks in the places where they need to be for the player to have fun, right? It's not the game designer who decided that this set of blocks is going to be here. It was the level designer. But the game designer said, there's going to be this type of block that you can never break. There's going to be this type of block that you can break if you're big, or that turn into coins if you hit a POW block, right? It's a game designer that decides the red guy is going to patrol on an area, and the green guy is just going to walk off the ledge, right? That's a game designer's job, is to define what elements there are, how they behave, how they interact. More generally, the flow of menus and that kind of thing can fall under the game designer's responsibilities. And then communicating that properly to the other people on your team, right? Because it's one thing to have it all in your head, and it's entirely another thing to have it on paper and to communicate it to other people, right? Has anyone ever written a game design document? Yeah. Is that a new term for anyone? No. So okay, sure, tomorrow. So you write the game design document, which says, ideally, everything that there is in the game is in the game design document, right? And this is kind of where we get into the user experience of a developer, right? Because that's another aspect, is how the developer's user experience is, right? So I've done a lot of tools development this year, and because my user experience was very bad as a developer. So the user experience of the team, when I write this document, it's like, okay, now everyone has this reference, but no one is going to read that document cover to cover. No one. I'm the only one who knows the whole thing. The sound guy is going to scroll down to the sound page and read that, right? If there's anything about sound in another part that I say, like, well, I can write this here because it's related to the actions of the player, it doesn't matter. If it's not in the sound thing, it's not going in the game because the sound guy is not going to read it, right? To the same effect, if I release a new version of this, right, and I send it out to everyone, like, here's the updated GDD, check it out, please, for the love of God, because if you don't, then it's going to be bedlam, right? But that's not good. I can't expect anyone to reread stuff and comb through it and identify what's different, right? I have to provide a change list. I have to say exactly what I've changed where. Ideally, show the changes in, like, you track changes in your document, right? And that kind of thing. So I think actually the job of a designer includes considering the user experience of your fellow developers, as the rest of your team, right? I also consider myself in charge of morale. Not in charge of, but like it's part of my responsibility, right? No one said, Travis, you have to raise morale. But if the team's morale is down, the product's going to be lackluster, right? It's not going to have the same kind of soul that we'll find if everyone's happy, everyone's on the same page, and so you can actually kind of have different models of documentation. I've watched a lot of YouTube talks or GDC talks. Like if you want to know anything about video game development, just search GDC and then the name of that topic, documentation. And then you'll get, where did I see this? Maybe it was in one of those micro talks. Anyways, the point is that you kind of want to create documents unique to each discipline, right? Like a programmer. So let's say I'm creating this enemy design, right, for this guy, for this turtle, right? So I need to tell the programmer how to make this. So I'm going to say, state. Oh, that's the wrong one. I do a lot of flowcharts too. So that's like my state is walk, and then hit a wall, and then I turn around. and then back to walk, right? So a programmer is going to understand this very well, right? They can use a little state machine and then everything's great. If I give that to an artist, they're going to be like, what kind of walk? Like, is it a turtle? If it's a turtle, is it like down on the ground? Like, is it really slow? How do I animate it? Right? This doesn't make any sense to an artist. You want to provide reference images, right? You want to make them understand that everything has to, like the shell has to fit exactly within this 16 by 16 pixel art thingy. Artists will need a different kind of communication than a programmer and a sound guy, right? Sound guy wants a list of sounds, what they're used for, what contexts, right? Yeah, so that's more or less the responsibilities of a designer. Have I answered your question satisfactorily?
Yeah, thank you. It was clear that documentation refers to everyone, and game designer is responsible of making game fun and communicating in the same time.
Yeah, and keeping the vision, right? Like the sound guy's the expert, but he may have an idea for a solution that doesn't fit with the thing. And one of the hardest skills I had to develop was saying, no, I think that's wrong. I think we should do it this way, right? And part of the skill of that is communicating why you think it's wrong, getting them to understand and to be on board, and maybe they can provide an alternative solution, which is even better than either of us thought of initially, right? You had a question?
So it was interesting that you said that the user experience includes developers and other team members, which is an interesting point. But if, for the sake of conversation, we say that the user is the player and only focus on the player, you mentioned that the level designers are the ones that are directly dealing with the player experience by arranging things, but which makes sense. But now, as a game designer, when you define the rules and rules of the game and all, how much of player experience do you have in mind when you're designing those things?
Yeah,
how that player experience thought is divided between the original game designer and the level designer who actually directly designed it?
It kind of works on a different scale. How do I do this? I'm unscrewing something. I'm not sure. I should unscrew it. Here we go. Check. It's not going to fall off or anything? So the designer-user relationship, I read the Donald Norman book, so I have a model of action and designer-user interaction. So that's my user, okay? This guy's a little eyeball, and his little ear, okay? And his little hand. This is all we have, right? To interact with our player is the sound and the screen and the controller, right? That's our interface. So we should, as game designers, ideally, consider the user experience at every point of the way, right? In something as inane as menus, okay? A menu is very, very important. If a menu is too complicated, it could lose a player, right? They could drop out right away. In the early days of Nintendo, there was a paradigm where it's 3 buttons to playtime, right? When you plug the game in, you turn it on, you should only press a maximum of 3 buttons before you are playing the game, which dictates basically your menu design, right? Entry, 1 button to main menu, to level select, to confirm, right? Any longer than that, it's boring. Kids are going to get lost. Controls are a huge part of this, right? When they were figuring out what is a nice controller, they started with they started with a joystick and a keyboard, and people figured out eventually that was bad. But Nintendo kind of changed everything with their little square thing, right? Oh God. You know what that is, right? It was way better than a joystick, but still sucked to hold because it hurt your hand because it was jagged and kind of awkward. And so they did the SNES controller, which is rounder, a little bigger, and has these shoulder buttons, right? And then that got perverted into what we know now as the typical controller that has these shoulder buttons and like 2 joysticks and buttons on the joysticks. And Nintendo still nails this every time in terms of controls and usability. Other studios don't always. So you end up with a lot of action RPGs where you're expected to press like 3 buttons at the same time, but like with one, like you have to press the like these 2 buttons at the same time, and just like that's not possible, right? So for controls, like, you can't expect that of the player, right? It's an elegance thing, right? Donald Norman has a lot of interesting things. Anyone read Donald Norman? Yes, it's okay. So he talks a lot about telephone systems. In the 70s and 80s, I guess they were doing a lot of experimentation with different telephone systems, and you know, we recognize like a typical industrial phone, right, with the handle there and like a million buttons all over the place, right? Each button has its own command and its own label, right? That's good. It doesn't matter how many buttons there are, as long as every single one has one purpose and a label that tells you what that purpose is. Any idiot can look at the phone and say, I want to go to line 2, right? And they don't have to think about like how many times do I have to press the hang up button to change the lines. Like, no, press that button, it does its job, right? In games, it's a little complex, right? Because we're doing something time sensitive, right? Most of the time, sometimes it's not, but it's usually an action game, so you have to understand the player's physical dexterity, right? Yeah, so you want to have, and this is another point where elegance and the user experience are kind of interconnected, right? We go back to Mario here. There's one action that Mario does. Jump. Okay, 2. You can shoot fireballs. But that's an elegant system, right? You can create infinite challenges from those basic functions, right? As we've seen, they just don't stop releasing Mario games, so there's clearly no end to what you can do with a system like this. So you may, like, I have a lot of game ideas, right? And a lot of them are very grand. But the challenge as a game designer is to take all of your ideas for this game and cut the ones that don't work, or that you don't need, right? Maybe they will work, right? They're nice to have, right? But you just put them in the nice to have bin, and there they stay forever, right? Because when you finish the things that you do need, you end up with a fun game, and you're like, okay, actually it would suck with those other things because we don't need it, right? So elegance in game design is what we strive for, right? Yeah. I was just kind of Asim.
Yeah, I have a question. Maybe it's a long question. Maybe I can divide it into 2-3 different sub-questions. Just to make it simpler for you. Because I understand like interface designing for game is one of the difficult tasks when you're think about the human-computer interaction. Because I compare the games I compare with market-driven products because you do not directly involve the users as far as usability is concerned. So what factors do you think, do you plan just to make the interface successful and keep the interest of the people, just to attract the people? Because users' involvement in the game, different tasks, different challenges, a very difficult job. Maybe sometimes people like that kind of activity to make the interface. So what parameters do you think to make your interface successful and interested for the user? Because Because in bespoke product, you involve the client, you involve the people, they give you feedback. But whenever you're designing a game, so the whole big community is your target, like maybe many countries or maybe many continents. So and people have different thinking, behavior process. So how do you make it? How do you decide like what kind of interface, what kind of tasks, challenges, these objects? How do you plan the interface? Like, is there any special mechanism you use, like any strategy, any plan to make the interface successful, to make the product successful?
So you keep saying interface and product.
Ultimately, the game is your product, and interface is the medium that, with the help of interface, you play that, you
Right.
access your product, you know?
This is my interface, right?
Yes.
So, yeah, it's a big question. So for me, when I hear user interface, it applies specifically to like menus, heads up display.
Plus, this is the interface as well, like the game interface, because the user is interacting with this interface. The user doesn't know what is happening at the back of this screen. You know, understand my point? This interface. So how do you plan and decide these challenges and these flying objects? What to do, what not to do, how to do? What is the parameter? What is the criteria to decide these things?
Well, I think one of the the starting place. You want the starting place to be what's the motivation of the player? Like, why is the player playing your game? Why are you making a game for that player? And the answer is to fulfill some desire of the player, right? So people like Quantic Foundry are doing research on player motivation. There are multiple models. This is one of them. Some players just want action. Some players want a social experience. Some players want to experience mastery. That's me. An achievement, also me. Immersion, also me. And creativity. So, so if you can kind of figure out what you can map this out. Like, let's say. This is if you're really doing like metrics-driven design. This is one way you can approach it. You can have each of these points be one of these motivations, right? And map out your game in terms of that. So maybe it looks like this, right? So you're really focused on these 4 points and not really much on these other two. And then you can start to make decisions about. I mean, if you have the game already in mind, right? Then there's a lot of things you have to. It's just like if you're looking at a holistic view of understanding the player and your game as intimately connected, right? Because the game doesn't really exist without the player, right? It's not actualized without the player. It's like any piece of music. You can write a piece of music, but is it a piece of music unless someone plays it? I don't know. I think it's just paper, right? So when you have your game idea and you know who you're making it for, then you want to make decisions about the pace of the game. The level of challenge, right? If you're making Mario 2, right? You expect that the audience has played Mario 1, so you can make it more difficult, right? The question of games literacy is very important, I think, in this day and age, because you have people like me who've been playing games since they were 6, and you have my mom who hasn't, right? But video games can also still appeal to her, right? So, but I'm not going to make a Twitch platformer for my mom. So I don't have to worry about. There's like the tutorial, right? The famous tutorial. This game doesn't have a tutorial, right? The tutorial is the level design, right? What does the player need to know at any given moment? So I'm all over the place because your question is very broad. But when you're playing this game, you don't really need to know much. And in fact, there is no interface, right? Like that's what you see when you open the game, right? When you die, then you know how many mans you have left, you know, how many tries before your game over, right? But only when you die, because during gameplay, it's not important, right? If you look at gameplay from Breath of the Wild, I think, so I will reference Breath of the Wild a lot in my talks because I think it's a masterpiece. This thing, so here's the, oh dear. Just show me that image, yeah? Whatever. You have the, no. So they have, here's a little map. Here's the nearest shrine. You're looking for these. That tells you how hot you are, how cold you are, and how much noise you're making, and how many hearts you have, and what your buttons do, and what your, it gives you a lot of information. You can turn most of that off in the options, right? Because they recognize that they will have players of various skill levels who want different levels of immersion. The UI breaks the immersion, right? So if you're looking to appeal to this kind of person, right? UI, you want as little as possible, right? Maybe instead of a health bar, you show, in a lot of games these days, when you take damage, they'll put red all over the screen, right? To show you're taking damage, you're about to die, right? Because red is bad and red is bloody, and that has a very visceral feeling, right? It much more than like beep 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 beep, your health is low. It's more immersive in that sense. Whereas if I'm creating a social game, then I want to know my HP and the HP of all my friends. Maybe I'm the healer, right? I need to be able to know when my friend's HP is at a low percentage. So that's why we have like 8. World of Warcraft has really intense UI, right? I never played this game, so but I do know that you can see, like I imagine that's someone else in your party, and you can see what their HP is at all time, right? And you can click on that icon to target them, right? Because in terms of usability, right, you have two options. You can say you have to click on their model in the world, or you can click on that, right? And of course you can do both in this game, but the fact that you can click that to target them makes it way easier for the player, because they're not looking to be an expert at this game necessarily. They're looking to have a social experience, right? So they allow for, they make it easier to do certain things for the social people, right? For the people who are not interested in being the best player of this game, right? Celeste is a platformer, a very high skill platformer. Yeah. So in Celeste, it's like a very high skill platformer, and they give you the option of slowing down the game to a small fraction of its original speed, which means that even if you've never played a platformer before, you can easily pass through the game because it's so slow, right? There's a lot of margin for error. Yeah, so there's a lot of different principles that go into that.
Is it easy for a beginner to see where assist mode is? Like, I'm curious about the onboarding experience for beginner users who they might not enjoy the game right away because they're not in the right mode, but that game didn't have a tutorial, at least they have the level tutorial, but certain beginners or anyone might not know what they're supposed to do, and they might just quit the game without getting to the point where they've kind of figured it out.
Yeah, I mean, I played through the whole game without knowing that this was a thing. So that's a very valid point. Like,
as a designer, how can you think about the different users and ensure that the different users get the information instructions at the right time, maybe? Like,
well, I just thought of a couple of examples, a couple of ways that you could do it. The first time you boot up the game, you just highlight the assist mode. Just be like, hey, just so you know, this is here. Maybe you detect how many times the player dies within the first 20 minutes of the game, and then you say, hey, by the way, there's assist mode. You know, Nintendo has done a little bit of that. So in Super Mario 3D World, if you die a certain amount of times in the same level, they will just spawn you a power-up at when you respawn, right? And that'll make it much easier for you to pass through the level, because they recognize that you've died so many times that you must need help, right? And as an expert player, I'm incensed. I take the power up bitterly and say, I don't need this, but I'm going to take it anyways. But that does help.
Resident Evil 4 also does something similar. If you die like multiple times, they like reduce the number of enemies and like stuff like that.
Right, and they don't tell you.
Even they're telling you, yeah. So you might not even realize it.
Yeah, that's a beautiful system for me, right? Because why are we playing these games, right? We're not playing these games to frustrate ourselves. We may get frustrated while we're playing, right? But the goal is that sweet sensation at the end of the frustration, right? It's like, yes, I did it, bastard. And what that system allows you to do as a designer is to create a very challenging thing and like frustrate the player and then give them that sensation, even if they didn't really earn it. They don't need to know, right? Yeah.
And that links to what Ralph Koster in Theory of Fun says, that it's about learning. So the game is boring when you don't learn anything, and it's frustrating when it's too hard to learn.
Yeah.
So you don't want to make it too hard to learn. You want them to eventually pass the course, in a sense,
Yeah.
and learn something and go over. That's why you give them the power up. So okay, it's not too frustrating.
There's a great book called Flow by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, and he talks about this kind of target zone, right? Where this is, where do we put skill? Doesn't matter. So this is where we want to be, right? We want to make the challenge line up with the skill, right? So if your skill is 0, there's about this much breadth that you have to challenge the player, and as soon as the skill increases, if you're not increasing the challenge, I'm going to get bored, right? And if you have too much challenge when you start out, we're going to get frustrated, we're going to stop playing, right? And so what Resident Evil 4 does is it detects that you're up here, and it's just like, let's put you down here, yeah? Oh, you're still having trouble. Let's just knock you down there, right? And that's that's kind of beautiful on one end, because that's absolutely someone saying the player needs to have a better experience here, right? So, have I more or less answered your question?
Yeah, that's okay. One more question came into mind related to that one.
I'm going to ask if anyone else has a question, or if I've left anything unanswered or anything unclear. Just like, yes.
So I can guess what your answer is, but maybe for some people who may be a little confused. So if you're coming from an CI background or anything like that, there are a series of terms that have particular meanings.
Oh.
For example, user interface versus user experience.
Okay.
So in games, the user interface is what you show. So
Yeah.
the control, the menus, the perspective to the game, which is first person, second person, those things define the user interface. Is that correct that in this space, say in the context of game, user interface is separate from gameplay? So like for example, Ernest Adams in game design book it gives a definition similar to other people that gameplay is goals, rules, challenges, actions.
Yep.
That is the gameplay. By that definition, theoretically, you can take the same gameplay and put it in a different interface.
Yep.
It could be a text-based RPG, and then you can take the same RPG and put it in a 3D visual, very multimedia-rich experience, but
Right.
it's the same
Right.
gameplay in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen that with Zelda. I'm going to talk about Zelda. The Link's Awakening, which is what they took a Game Boy game and they made it fully HD, beautiful graphics, exactly the same game.
Right.
Much more beautiful experience.
So does that make sense in that way to say that user interface is separate from gameplay, but user experience is not, because user experience is controlled by the gameplay? Would that make sense to you, saying something like that?
I think user experience encompasses both.
Yeah.
The user interface, it depends, because so this game and many like it, right? It's a match 3 game. No, I just want to see the image. So that's so here, like basically no part of this is not the interface, right? This is the gameplay, right? This is not gameplay necessarily, but it defines your actions. Let me just tell you how the game works, right? You have to connect these swords to deal damage to monsters, and they disappear. It's typical match 3. Well, actually, it's not that typical, but it's a touch controls, right? So I drag this sword over there. The whole line moves that way. And then if I let go and these 3 are connected, they disappear. I deal some damage to the zombie. We see the zombie's HP somewhere, and we know that we have to keep dealing damage. So then this is over there. Anyways, so you keep connecting swords. You connect some wands to deal damage from a distance. You connect chests to open chests. If you're in front of a chest, you have to connect chests in order to open it, or else if you reach this, you die, right? So in this case, I think you cannot separate the interface from the design, right? From the gameplay. They're integrated, right? In a case like Zelda, the screenshot I showed before, here the interface is separate from the gameplay, right? And you can even turn the interface off, right? And the gameplay is unchanged. So yeah, it depends on the game, depends on the context, yeah. Anything here that someone wants to learn about? Some people have to do level design in the future. Yeah.
How would that work for your process as a game designer? So when you are designing the game, where do you start?
Where do I
With the user
start?
interface, with the gameplay, what is the process in your mind? I'm assuming it may not be the same for every designer, but for you personally, what is the process?
Well, that's like a question for any creative person. What is your process like, right? And in this particular case, again, it depends. So in my job, it starts with the client. It starts with what they want, right? So I'll use an example. We were approached by Ocean Spray to make some games to sell cranberry juice. Okay. So they came to us with some characters that they wanted to have in the games. They wanted cranberries featured heavily in most of the games. And that's about it. And a target audience, 3 to 5, okay? So so these are the elements that these are the like kind of my building blocks, and then I have to start like kind of arranging them and seeing, does that stand? Yes. Is it better like this? You know. So then I'm brainstorming. Okay. From then when I have my given circumstances. So this is, hold on, I have a talk about this. I think it's this one, yeah. No, why did you switch them around? I was going to switch them around again. Okay. So the two things you need to know is what are your given circumstances, and then what is your target, what's your goal, right? And then you have a toolbox of creative practices that you use to make a game design, right? And a game design can be as simple as a mock-up. Well, I guess I should just scroll through the slides. What's this? Oh yeah. Explaining what it is to be a polymath method. Know your constraints, gather your tools, use your tools to build more constraints, and repeat. So this is for level design, but I think it can be applied to game design too. So one of the characters that they wanted in this game was a frog, right? So I'm thinking, okay, what kind of game can a frog be implicated in, right? And an obvious answer is jumping, right? So then you start thinking about how, because you have to understand the platform that you're working with, right? And the game's literacy of the player, all these factors that you have to kind of put in. It's a lot like cooking, right? You have to use the ingredients you have, right? Maybe you have someone coming over that's allergic to everything but a few kinds of food. You have to take those and make something interesting out of them, right? And it really takes practice. Like the only answer I can give you is practice, is to keep doing it. And
this is very interesting. This is like the method that you have here. Can you demonstrate that through one like game design example? So what do you mean by building more constraints and tools?
I have a whole list of what. So these are the given constraints that I work with for one game that we made called Henry Danger. We have client stipulations. We have game mechanics. We have to take into consideration our player experience, the progression of the game. We have to design as a whole. Like, how long is the game experience? Is it procedural? Are we going to generate levels through code or otherwise? And you know, all these people, and then you start making your own, right? So brainstorming. What I mean by brainstorming is saying, okay, I need 10 solutions to this one problem, and you list them all, right? It starts to get hard around 6 or 7, but you have to keep going, right? You keep going until you have more than 10 or more, right? And that's when they start to get good, and then you can start to combine them, right? Yeah, IDSX, right? And there's 10 million again. What is this down here? Looks like Warcraft or something. Oh no, it's some city builder. Anyways, in 10 million in that game, you wake up in a room with no one else and a big door that says the number 10 million on it. The big door that says freedom, I guess. And maybe I can find the UI. Here it is. Yeah. So your current score, and then how much you need in order to be free, right? So you're captured. You're in prison. You're basically in prison until you've played this game enough that you can finish, right? why did I bring that up? Yeah, IDSX. You put your ideas together. I created a checklist, again, for level design, but there's more for game designs. This is kind of a map of progression. So I decide at what point the player is going to learn each of these skills. When you are, so this is a consideration you have to have for level design and game design, is what skills the player is going to use in the game. So I'm trying not to get too far off your question, which was about,
in your slide,
methods.
you were talking about building more constraints, and I just wanted to see if you could give us some examples of building more constraints.
Okay, so this is an example. It's in level design, but maybe you'll learn something from it. So once we have the game design, right? Let's say I'm doing this frog jumping game, right? Well, this is for a 3-lane runner, right? You have your character is on one of 3 lanes, and you can switch between them, and you have to avoid obstacles that appear in those lanes, right? Very simple controls, up and down. That's all I have, right? But then, so I have to do the work of deciding what kind of skills come out of that system, right? So a sidestep is just one movement. I see an obstacle, I have to move out of the way. It's my sidestep. A deke means I'm going down and then back up, or up and then back down, right? I just gave it these names because it's helpful for me, but GTFO means I'm going from the top all the way to the bottom, right? There's 2 rocks here, and I have to go all the way down. In Montreal, it means you're avoiding a giant pothole, so you have to go all the way up and then all the way back down, right? And so they get more and more complex as they go along, and I decide when I'm going to introduce them. This is before I have even touched a level editor, okay? The very first thing I do before I even start designing the levels is create a spreadsheet like this. So here I decide what kind of challenge I'm going to give the player. So I'm going to give it's an arbitrary scale from 1 to 6, I guess. Level of challenge that I'm giving the player. I start at a 2. In level 1, I'm saying sidestep you can handle a 2, deke, GTFO, and careen you can handle a 1 each, right? And those are the only skills that I'm going to test in that level, right? Because I have to assume if I'm going to do another level that's going to test for these, right? I have to assume that they've already learned them, right? And then I can up the challenge on those, right? And it's only if I'm going to introduce a new one, right? Then I'm not going to ramp up the challenge much on these, right? And so this is what I mean about creating new restrictions. Now I have this spreadsheet. This becomes my set of restrictions for when I'm doing level design, right? When I'm making level 1, I know I have to do sidesteps that are not super basic, but still pretty basic, and then very basic dekes, GTFOs, careens. Hello? Mouse? Oh, he moved on. This is another example. I just want to make sure I have nothing else to say on that subject of creating more constraints. In game design, if I want to make constraints about, if I want to make more constraints, like, I'm not sure it works that well in game design, actually. I'll think about that a little more.
That you add rules of the game and things like that will count as those constraints? When you add different rules to your game when you're designing the game as well?
Yeah, so, okay, so actually that's, you made me think of something, which is pillars of game design. Okay, so often in game design talk, you'll hear about someone mentioning the pillars of their game design, which is going to be like, combat. Oh dear, it's still broken. Are we out of time?
We're not out of time, but we are finishing very shortly, about 3 minutes left.
Wrapping up.
You know, combat and movement and progression. Okay. So if you define pillars of game design at the start of your process, these are your optional constraints, right? Then you can help make decisions that support these, right? And if you, because game design is really a practice of making a million decisions, because like you're basically carving out possibility space, like I said before, for level design, and it's helpful to think of a metaphor like sculpting, right? So if I'm a sculptor, I have a block of marble. There are unknowable infinities of options for me, right? And I have to decide what I'm going to do, roughly, more or less, when I start chiseling, right? But that doesn't mean that it can't change, right? Like maybe one sculptor said, I'm not making a sculpture. The sculpture's already there. I'm just revealing it, right? And maybe you've created a figure, but suddenly you realize that it's kind of hunched over and he's kind of a tragic figure, so you're going to make his face sad, right? And that kind of thing. So, so in game design, you have to decide on player abilities, what enemies they're going to be, what the goals are, how the character progresses through the game, and you want to do that in terms of your pillars, right? And your pillars should line up with your player motivations, right? So yeah, practice. Like it's really a thing where you don't know how hard it is until you start trying it, right?
Maybe we can give time to someone who have an answer, ask any questions, and ask some questions.
Yeah. Actually, I wanted to ask a question. You listed kind of your method and the 4 points, and the last one was repeat until constraints allow only one possibility.
Yeah.
How do you kind of account for puzzles that maybe have multiple solutions, or like, let's say like a stealth game where you have multiple options on how to kind of solve the puzzle or something? How would you kind of, would that be different in some sense, or?
I think you can still follow that method. It's when I say one possibility, I mean one possibility for the level, right? Right. So part of your constraints can be, I want there to be multiple ways to solve this thing, right? And then you can say, I want the brute force method, where I kill everyone. I want the go through the vents method. I want the distract the guards method.
Right.
And all those have to be possible, so that become part of your constraints, right? And that's where you arrive at your single possibility for the level, right? If you say we're gonna infiltrate this factory, right? So you start with that's a constraint right there, the factory, right? That it is a factory. You have to understand what a factory looks like and how it works, and then you identify what types of what are the ways you want to be able to pass through the level, right? Because there aren't going to be very many accidental ones. They're all put in by the designer, and some of them give the player the impression that they thought of it, right?
Right.
That's when you really know you're doing a good job, right? When you present an obvious solution and allow for a non-obvious solution that makes the player feel they're smart, right? Yeah, and it's kind of like chiseling, right? You're carving out, you're taking out things that you don't want to do, right? And you end up with something that hopefully is good, right? Do user testing, yeah. Have people play your stuff and watch them, and not just about. I'm kind of just like saying random stuff now because I'm running out of time, but you have an idea of how things are going to work, but you don't know it all until you have a player test them, and you want to watch, like I see a lot of people talking about metrics, and like you want to be able to track what your players are doing and when they drop out, and then the problem with that is that you don't see why they're dropping out, you just see when they're dropping out, and then you don't understand that it's actually the 3 levels before that I found were frustrating, and then this level they dropped out because they had had enough at that point, right? And so it's actually the 3 levels lining up to that. This level wasn't the problem, it was those 3 levels, right? And so if you're watching the player, you could see their emotional reactions to those 3 levels, and you can be like, I see what's going on, right? much more powerful, I think, than metrics, but a smaller sample size because there's only a limit to your attention and physical space.
Any other quick questions?
Long questions you can send to me by email. Yeah.